Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. I can see that people are joining. It's very exciting to have today such a great set of panelists to discuss, the role of science in driving policy change and in getting us to net zero. So this is a webinar jointly organized by the EEAC and IEEP. The panel will, there will be two consecutive panels that will take us to 11:15. Let me first start with some logistical remarks. So this will be recorded, so you can have the recording available on the IEP channels. You will have opportunities as participants to ask questions in the Q&A. So if you have a questions, do put it in the Q&A. If you have comments or if you want to share any materials that you have that are relevant to the topic, please use the chat. So we want to make this as engaging and interactive as possible. So please use those two channels so we can hear from you and your perspectives. So in terms of introduction, so first to say is, I'm very happy as the director of IEP, we're a sustainability think tank. We have a strong commitment to evidence-based policy making. We are now, on the high-level group for the economic and social impact of research in RTD. We're also in the taxonomy expert group. And before this morning, I went back to look at our first piece that we wrote in 2018, where we were calling for a European panel for sustainability as one of the ways to close the loops between science and policy. So it's very exciting to be all of us here, given that the climate law did create a European climate change advisory board, and I know the panelists will speak to that quite a bit. I also think it's a very interesting time for science because of the COVID crisis. I think many times we saw clashes between, I would say, the ethics of conviction and the ethics of science, as Max Weber would put it. And I think many of those challenges about the time of science versus the time of policy, I'm sure we'll come back to them when we are discussing the challenges that science also have in terms of informing policymakers and driving policy choices. So let me first give the floor to Arnaud Cadal-Bassa from the EEAC, and then we'll get on with our panel. So welcome again. Arnaud, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Celine. I'm pleased to also welcome you on behalf of the EEAC Network, the Network of European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils. As a network, we bring together institutional bodies that advise both governments and parliaments with regard to, obviously, climate change, the environment, and sustainable development. All 18 members of the network have to provide advice which transcends sectoral interest and which is underpinned by sound scientific knowledge. This is our core task. This is what we are experienced in some cases, for more than 30 years. Today, in this webinar, we will touch upon the relevance of scientifically sound policy advice and its role in EU policy making. We will pay special attention to the climate change and agricultural policy domains. Both these domains present major challenges. Let's face it, and allow me to quote the IPCC here: unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to close to 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius, will be beyond reach. In a response to the climate change challenges, as you know, the EU put forward substantial ambitions, both in its climate law and in its Fit for 55 package. It will, however, all be about when and how we will implement all proposed measures. This will determine whether we will be successful in protecting our life support systems. The role of scientific policy advice in this implementation process is crucial. You know, such advice can increase overall societal benefits of policies. And this is of major importance given the disruptive nature of the transformation towards a climate neutral society. Scientific policy advice, as you know, also ensure holistic and cross-sectoral perspective, overcoming overly narrow sectoral interests and ensuring that the multi-layered and multi-level challenges of climate change are dealt with in an integrated fashion. To conclude, I would like to make the case for a strong presence of scientific policy advice in the public discourse. This in order to highlight important issues for policymakers, interest groups, and the general public alike, ensuring that the often so highly politicized debate is fed with reliable facts and figures. I trust that several speakers will touch upon these issues more in depth during their presentation, sure. It's for this very reason that I'm so pleased that we have a very experienced and knowledgeable group of people present here this morning. I look sincerely forward to your input, views, and recommendations, as well as to the question posed to you. Before I give the floor back to you, Celine, allow me to reiterate that we sincerely hope that the future European Climate Change Advisory Board will be truly enabled to provide scientifically sound policy advice to the institutions. And I'm sure that I can say on behalf of the advisory bodies present in the EEAC network that we aim to establish a constructive working relationship with the board to ensure that we jointly can make both national goals and policies and EU-level goals and policy work together. So, Celine, I look forward to a very energetic, honest, and constructive morning. And it's a pleasure to host this webinar together with you and the colleagues of the IEEP. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this great introduction. And let's hope that we fulfill your expectations about the energy level, but I have great faith in the panel that the two panels we have. So the first panel will talk about what is referred to in the Brussels bubble as Fit for 55, but that just means the climate package. And we'll go back to what has been really proposed in terms of the role of scientific advice in recent European climate policy initiatives. And we're really, really excited to have on the panel three distinguished women. So Jette Guteland, Christina Moberg, and Elisa Gianelli. So who will all speak from their perspective. Let me first start by introducing, for those who don't yet know her, MEP Guteland. She's a Swedish Social Democrat and a member of the parliament since 2014. She's the S&D coordinator to the ENVI committee. She's also a substitute in the AFET committee and a member of the ANET committee. And the most important part of her long biography for today is that she was the rapporteur and the lead negotiator for the European climate law. And she has also long-standing experience because before she was the shadow rapporteur on the EU ETS revision. So MEP Guteland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Celine, and thank you, IEEP, for inviting me to this interesting webinar. I would like to start by saying that from my perspective as a member in the European Parliament, I could not strong enough highlight the importance of science. And since I'm in the Environment Committee, responsible for very at this moment outspoken topics like climate, environment, but also health, to mention a few of our competence fields. I would say science plays a huge role in all of them, and we often tackle complicated legislation, very technical, but also relevant for the society, and it is about our member states and our future societies. And when it comes to these three fields that I mentioned, I would say science plays the role of making sure that we don't do one thing that will have the opposite effect or have a contrary effect to something else. And therefore science is for us, of course, a broad spectrum. It's not only for climate, the emissions cutting, it's also society, economic science, so we need different aspects. I was, as Celine mentioned, the rapporteur in the last year for the report on the climate law, and then also the negotiations, responsible for the European Parliament's negotiation in that law. And we heard very early in 2020, when we started the work in the spring, that there was suggestions about making sure that the climate law would introduce science in its own, make sure that that was part of the legislation. And I was very happy to launch that in my first report on the climate law, that we should have a European climate change advisory board, and that it should be independent and not be with representatives from member states, but of course take into perspective different parts of Europe, but still be independent and have experts on different relevant fields, and work with at least one report per year, and give us better tools to now know how the European Union is taking its responsibility towards the Paris Agreement, but also its own targets. And the reason was, of course, that I, as well as many others, have the feeling that we talk about science a lot. We get reports on the global level from the IPCC on climate. We have in our member states also councils that is very important for the national legislation. But on the EU level, we don't have a systematic way of making sure that in this big transition, that's the center of the European policy making for the upcoming decades, the very big transition that everything will circle around. We don't have a systematic way today to make sure that we listen to science, that we get incorporated in the debates, what science is saying. It's more of a media debate, a Twitter debate, discussions in the different bubbles around, but it's not systematically done when we work on climate. But then I would also like to say that I'm very happy that after discussions during the last year, it became reality. So we succeeded. So we will have this board with experts, 15 experts that will work on the reports that I mentioned, that will be listened to, that will be important, a new body, independent, and I really believe that will make a change. But yet I would like to also mention that even though I'm kind of one of the mothers of this board, I don't want people to think that I want to outsource the climate law making to experts. That's not it. It's about making a systematic way of incorporating science in the discussions, and then for the policy makers to be to know what we do, and also, of course, that we can be criticized for not listening, and it should be very obvious that we don't listen if we don't. But the responsibility will always be the representatives from the people in the parliament for that co-legislator, and also the government in the member states. I believe that's really important for democratic reasons, so no one thinks it's about something else. I will stop there for now, and I have a couple of other things that I hope that I can raise about Fit for 55 and the role that science should play also in the sectorial legislation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and again, congratulations for all the work you've done on this, because indeed it's been a success, and also for what you said in the end about that it should not be about outsourcing, and making it aware the power and responsibility of science lies, and where does the power and responsibility of democratically elected representatives start, because we've seen many debates where it becomes slightly muddled, and the issue is that then you get into the politicization of science, which is, as we know, is can feed at times into post-truth narratives that some people who don't want to listen to science for other reasons are very keen to jump on. So thanks a lot for that introductory remark. We will now turn to Christina Moberg. She is the president of the European Academy's Science Advisory Council, so indeed an independent council. And she's a professor emeritus in organic chemistry at the Royal Technical University in Stockholm, Sweden. And she's also, since 1998, a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And EEAC, in my view, is one of the bodies that has been there, and arguably probably not well known enough, because all the reports it has provided on the issue of sustainability have been really extremely spot on and very useful. So I'm very glad to hear from Christina. How does she see this role of science and the role of EEAC within it? And maybe explain more about how EEAC was formed and what it is consists of for those who don't know EEAC. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. First of all, I would like to say that as a scientist, I'm very happy to hear the member of the European Parliament stressing the role of science, because this is exactly what we do. And this is, of course, important because the European Union is indeed a very important arena for policymaking with very long-term effects on Europe's economy, society, and not least the environment. And therefore, for us, it's obvious that the decisions in the EU must be based on scientific evidence. And I mean, this is particularly important today with the big challenges like the climate crisis that we are facing today. The National Academies of Science realized this quite a long time ago, actually. And this is why EEAC was founded now 20 years ago. And EEAC is an association. EEAC stands for European Academy Science Advisory Council. And it is an association of the national science academies of the EU member states and Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. And EEAC mainly informs the EU institutions, but also to some extent the EU member states, and also to some extent the general audience, which is not least very, very important. So the challenges that we face today really require urgent and adequate actions, and many solutions to these the problems we have today are not trivial, and therefore decisions are needed to be guided by science. So what is then important for science advice? There are several things. First of all, the independence, because policymakers need reliable information, and it must come from impartial sources with no interest from the political outcomes, first of all, or from commercial or industrial interest. And it must be based on rigorous research, not by, say, opinion or advice from interest groups. Then it must be trustworthy. And EU policies, of course, has to be based on rigorous research. ESAC, via all the national science academies, have access to many of the most prominent scientists and researchers in Europe and the best expertise. And then, of course, it has to be relevant and timely. And ESAC works mainly within 3 areas, which are environment, energy, and the biosciences. And these areas are often very relevant for political decisions today. I will just mention, I think you can find also in the chat, the links to some recent reports. I will just mention some topics that we are working with, that we have recently compiled reports on. That is the forest, bioenergy and carbon neutrality, decarbonization of transport and decarbonizations of buildings, climate change and its effect on health, the ocean circulation and what will happen with the ocean circulation in the future. And we have presently a project ongoing on regenerative agriculture. I would also like to mention that we have written about transformative changes needed after the post-COVID and their priorities. And we recently also made an input from the European academies to the United Nations conferences on climate change and biological diversity, COP26 and COP15, which can be found from the ESAC homepage. But I would like to mention some of the problems that we have, because it's not always easy to the bridge between science and politics. Because scientists and decision makers, first of all, we speak with different languages and we have different working methods. And it can be difficult for politicians to assimilate scientific arguments, and also for scientists to understand the very rapidly changing world of policy. Scientists often engage in projects that can extend over years, whereas politicians work with tight time frames and often lacks the time also, which is necessary to assimilate complex issues. Usually politicians want quick answers, clear messages, and unambiguous advice. And also expect, rightly in most cases, I would say, that scientists convey the truth to politicians. But we must remember that although science provides the most secure knowledge and more secure than any other sources, science has an inherent uncertainty, because new research may lead to modifications of previous results, or even replacement in some rare cases. So policymakers need to realize that scientific evidence provided is not always a definite answer to a question which has been asked. It can also happen that some topics are polarizing and controversial, and the scientific advice may go against what the majority of citizens believe and think, and that can be very uncomfortable for politicians. In many cases, we have acute situations that can arise, and in such situations, very quick advice is needed. But in such situation, it can also happen that the available knowledge is lacking, or at least is insufficient. And in such situation, it happens that science does not speak with a unified voice. You can have different advice from different scientists. And that is what we have seen during the pandemic. And we then risk to lose some confidence for science. What is required then for the scientists is to be honest. and tell the limitation for the knowledge, which not always happened during the pandemic. It's science we lose if we scientists believe to have a kind of pretended security. We need to skillfully weight the uncertainties, even if that may seem confusing. We will then gain in honesty. I would also like to say something about that. Even if scientific evidence is the safest basis for rational positions and a solid basis for identifying the policy alternatives and for reaching decisions, we must realize that the fact that science is based on empirical facts, that does not always mean that in all situations, science should have a superior position when it comes to decision, because facts are often not enough. And scientists in particular need to realize that. Because when the scientist sees a technical problem that needs to be solved, a politician can see a societal problem. And in that case, it's not only scientific positions that are relevant. Science, for example, does not take a stand on moral issues, what is right or wrong. And science provides the knowledge, but the task of the politics is to balance knowledge and values. How much influence science should have, that depends on the nature of the question. In the present situation, where climate change is one of the most challenging questions we have, then I'm convinced that scientific evidence should be given priority indeed. What is needed is that science and politics need to build bridges, and better bridges than we have today, although that has been, the bridges have been built up, that they need to improve, because our democracy also depends on the presence of scientific conversation and on the fact that politicians have the ability to assimilate this. We must remember that scientists and politicians are not competitors, but we must work together. And to be able to reach the goal of the Green Deal, 55% net emission reduction by 2030 based on 1990 levels, and eventual climate neutrality by 2050, such cooperation is indeed necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina, for being a true scientist, meaning very honest and bringing the issue of uncertainty. And when we were preparing this panel, we reflected on the fact that many times intermediaries that present science to policymakers have a tendency to present the outcomes without talking about the limitation of the methodology, without talking about the uncertainty. So it makes it very difficult for legislators and other policymakers, especially when they are presented with what is looking like completely two different conclusions from science indeed. So thank you for giving also clues about how we deal with those complications, and that yes, science is important, but science is not does not always have the definitive answer indeed. Elisa, now turning to you, and so Elisa works for E3G, and E3G has played, quite an important role in the design of the European climate law, and did do quite a lot of work in terms of making sure that the science will really drive the outcome of the climate law, and especially regarding the advisory council. Elisa holds a BA in International Relations and Diplomatic Affairs from the University of Bologna, as well as an MA from Université Libre de Bruxelles. So Elisa, just tell us, how you have seen this policy process. How do you evaluate the outcome, and also very importantly, what must be done so the promises of this council, are turned into reality, because the implementation is done in the right way. Elisa?
Thank you, Celine, and thank you for the invite to this very interesting and timely discussion. Indeed, E3G has been part of a broader coalition of civil society organizations that have followed very closely the debate and then the negotiations on the European climate law. I'll maybe start from the beginning. As I said, together with a broader range of civil society organizations, our work started really to from analyzing the existing examples. And so what we did for once was really looking at how national level was doing and what we could learn from the national level and leverage it up to the European one. And what we realized really early on in the process is that there were a set of core elements defining existing climate laws, both in Europe and outside. We used to compare the European climate law to a vessel that had to hold the course towards the climate neutrality objectives. And in order to do that, of course, it has to be equipped by some tools, these core elements that would keep it online with the final destination. And one of that was indeed the European Scientific Advisory Board, or more generally, independent body as they are defined broader at national level. This tool, we compare it to a compass that was really helping in keeping the direction straight to the objectives and not deviate from the final destination. So what we did was, as I said, looking at the existing examples, finding the common elements and future. And it was very clear that, first of all, these bodies were in most of the case set up by the law themselves. So it was clearly part of the climate law as a project, and were generally mandated to do two different tasks. One being providing external advice. Sometime, for instance, that would be the results of participating in the definition of a national carbon budget. And then the other task would be more on the monitoring the progress towards the objectives. And as a result, you would have general outputs of having an annual report on how the government is doing towards the objectives. Now, Christina already mentioned some of the needs. I won't repeat them, but indeed, the most important thing was really making sure that there are dedicated resources that would allow to carry out these tasks, either via secretariat or via a known budget. And then the second one being about the membership and really identifying who should be part of this body in order to deliver the results that we want them to deliver. And it came out really clearly early on that we are not talking about a stakeholder body. We are not talking about a representative body. We are talking about scientific independent expertise sit together around the same table. The impact, of course, we realize that can vary depending on the degree to which the recommendations are taken into account by the government. But the benefits were already clear even before the European climate law proposal came out. I think that the next speakers will talk more about it, but I always identified at least three clear benefits. First one being contributing to provide really coherence and cross-cutting coherence across the policy portfolio. And so starting to implement that idea of climate policy being an holistic project and not only being targeted towards only climate and energy legislations. And I'll go back to that in a minute. The second one, really providing greater transparency and accountability that goes beyond the policy cycle. So something that really remains that as an overarching structure that is independent from elections, for instance, which may change policy priority and politics as well. And then finally, these bodies can really play a huge role in strengthening the legitimacy. And Celine, you mentioned what we can learn from the COVID crisis. I think that this is a really important point, because what this body can do is providing really the necessary backup to take tricky and complicated policy decisions that have big impacts on citizens' life. And I think that, you know, when you ask me what did we get eventually, and when you look at this long list of elements that were to be secured, I think we can be satisfied with the results. And we really got anything in there. When you read the climate law text right now, it really mentioned all these defining elements that can really ensure we eventually get to the results we wanted to. But I would say it's never enough, right? Right now we are in a momentum where the climate and energy public debate has changed compared to only 2 years ago. With the European Green Deal, I can clearly see how this holistic approach is key and central to any debate and policy proposal. We've seen that in the Fit for 55, and we've only seen the first part of the package. And we know that delivering these objectives won't be easy and will require really big changes in a limited time scale. And managing these changes is complicated, because eventually what we want to do is providing benefits to citizens' lifestyles, not damaging them. So it won't be easy, and the Fit for 55 negotiations will be a big challenge. And at the same time, they will really provide, I think, the opportunity to prove the results of the intense negotiations during the European climate law. Because what the law does is setting the framework. And as I said, we have all the elements. Even beyond the independent advisory board, we have good governance tools that can really make sure this vessel hold the course, but we need to implement them. And so the Fit for 55 and more broadly the European Green Deal really put up and increase the time pressure on whoever will be responsible to implement the climate law, to deliver these tools as soon as possible, so we can make use of them even during the negotiations of the upcoming policy proposals. And only by doing that, I think we can't probably be sure 100%, as Christina said, that there are some uncertainty, and it's good to recognize them. But we can definitely improve our current status quo in terms of ensuring this cross-cutting and holistic approach being really implemented, and climate objectives being really streamlined across the European portfolio, not only of this silos approach. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and thank you for highlighting the benefits, the potential benefits, the cross-cutting coherence, the accountability beyond policy cycles, knowing that the Green Deal is technically a communication, so can end at the end of the mandate of the Commission. So really important beyond electoral results to have this continuity of science, and also the importance of the legitimacy that science can bring to sometimes difficult policy choices. Before we take questions from the public, I wanted first to come back to MEP Guteland, because indeed we are now in the second step after the climate law, Fit for 55, where we will enter into the messy politics of sectoral files. And you highlighted that you wanted to say a few words regarding, what you see in terms of the role of science and possibly that body or other elements in advising this process around the sectoral files under Fit for 55.
Thank you again, Celine, and thank you also to the panel, because it's very interesting to hear the perspectives. I would like just to mention that I believe the role of science is still having a very important role in the Fit for 55 package. We have the climate law, but yet, one example, this summer, IPCC report was very not only alarmistic, it was truly scary to read the IPCC report this summer about the consequences if we don't go faster and have a more ambitious climate policy, both in the European Union, but also globally, and where we see that 80 countries around the world is not implementing the Paris Agreement at all, and the rest is not doing enough. So I believe with the sectorial legislation, we need not only to do what the climate law is demanding, but we also need to go further. And I believe then that it will be very important with also the role of the European Climate Change Advisory Board, but I also believe we need other systematic ways of, for each sectorial legislation, have a way of working that will help us. And the European Commission, often in their impact assessment, they don't use, they don't go further than their own targets. We've seen that with the climate law, that they didn't want to investigate if we should do more to 2030 than their own proposals. So we didn't have impact assessments that were good enough for us. Hopefully we will have better tool, as I mentioned, with the board that we speak about, but still I'm a bit afraid that we will still have that gap. We will not have that bridge between science and policy making in place for the sectorial legislation. And I think we need to talk about how to handle that and get better ways to do it. And then just one final thing is that I also believe in other, when we don't work with the climate legislation, but for example, the chemicals and the legislation for chemicals, there is always a huge hole where we don't have very easy, it's not an easy task because we don't have science on everything. And when I had a couple of seminars with scientists, they tell me that if you look at the water as one example, there is a lot of water in the seas that we have not explored. We don't have resources for that. And the chemical cocktails that we see, we cannot investigate, we cannot have enough data for this to know enough. So there's not a good result to present for the legislators what is happening with the chemicals, because it's such a big field and we don't have resources to investigate it. And that is a gap. And I feel that gap. I think we need, of course, to use the precautionary principle that we're supposed to use when we don't know. But still, I think we need more resources to work more on the chemicals. And I think scientists need also to get funding for do that important work.
Thank you very much for bringing up this difficult issue of funding and funding of independent research, because as you highlight on chemicals, but there are so many files, automotive emissions at some point where the people who held the best data obviously had a bit of a conflict of interest because they were representing the industry. And we see, we need to also come clean with the fact that sometimes there is evidence that's being produced and that might not be with the best intentions. And it's indeed very difficult then for the legislator to know what to do. And as you say, the precautionary principle, still holds. And I would, for those who haven't read it, there's a late lessons from early warnings, which is still a very important reading from the EEA, which goes back to all those cases where early warnings were not looked at sufficiently early from science. So then turning to questions, there are quite a few, so let me try first with Volmer de Haan. What branches of science are, in your opinion, underrepresented in climate debates and climate advice so far? I mean, it's a question specifically for Christina, but maybe other members of the panel would like to hear from it. And Volmer de Haan is from the EEAC.
What is represented? I think the basic sciences and the basic understanding is essential. And then, of course, you need to have an insight into climate issues. I think that since we in ESAC have access to all the academies within the European Union, all the national science academies, I think that we have the expertise that is really needed. And I mean, we need a variety of expertise in order to do that. So we need big panels in order to provide the scientific advice that is needed.
Thanks, Christina, which brings us back to the fact that it's going to be 15 experts, so probably not representing all bodies of science. And there are quite a lot of comments and questions from the audience about where do you set the hierarchy of scientific inputs? Because obviously you have the GRC, you have the EEA, you have the IPCC, you have also think tanks like IEEP and E3G. And there was also another question about how can an independent scientist not linked with any of those bodies participate, contribute. We have so many scientists who are activists, would like to be putting their knowledge at the service of the great transition. So I don't know whether any of you would want to answer about, this sort of ecosystem that needs to be put in place with some degree of hierarchy within it. And I'm sure that in the second part of the panel, we'll talk about the hierarchy between the EU and the national level indeed.
May I just give a short comment here? I think it's very difficult for a single scientist to give an input, and maybe that is not what should be done, because I think that we need bigger panels. So we put together bigger panels, but then who should you listen to? I mean, we have collaboration with several other networks. We have a memorandum of understanding with the GRC, for example, and we have worked quite a lot with commissioners, and so there is a collaboration between different organizations. And we also publish papers in the scientific peer-reviewed journals, which are then read by IPCC panels. So there is a collaboration between the different organizations.
Thanks. Collaboration is definitely one way to go. Elisa?
Yeah, if I may add, I think that Mrs. Guteland also touched upon that in the opening remarks. What we really wanted to see eventually in the final text was this systemic type of relationship between this body and the European policymaking, which it was missing at the time. Of course, you could open endless debate on what is independent and how do you ensure independency and who checked the independency. I think one way, again, learning from the national experiences was to define strict criteria on how to appoint the members and making sure that, for instance, there was a broad range of disciplines represented. As you said, it's limited to 15 people, but 15 people can bring a different portfolio in terms of disciplines to be represented when discussing climate and energy policies. And again, yes, it's true, bigger is better, but the problem of resources was a problem. And what we really wanted to avoid was having a duplication of existing bodies that are, of course, already delivering excellent work. And they just didn't need anything more than that to deliver that.
I also add one thing, that we also have the science advice mechanism, which was founded by the European Commission. And EEAC actually is one of the networks making up the SAPEA, which is part of the science advice mechanism. So that means that there's also broad collaboration with lots of expertise, and the science advice mechanism work directly with the Commission.
Thanks, Christina. MEP Guteland, did you want to add anything?
No, I think it has been said better than I would express it, so I don't need to say so much more. I think it is about collaboration, but it's also that what we also found was missing was that the EU level is such a potent lawmaker when it comes to the climate policy, and yet we have IPCC, who is telling where is the world going, how do we follow the Paris Agreement, and also all the scenarios on the global heating and what that means. So we already have that, and many member states have also their council work on climate and with different scientific field giving input to legislators in implementing the climate policy and also their own climate policy. So there we also have it, but on this very strong political level, that is the regional level, the union level, we didn't have a very strong body to give us advice on the more how we do with our own targets, and also on the climate, on the Paris Agreement. And I mean on the own target, how could IPCC evaluate our own targets? This is not for them, and it is not for the national councils either to evaluate how the European Union is delivering its own targets. So I believe there was a missing gap here. Of course, we have EEA, who is so important and give us such a knowledge and have a lot, maybe the most in its walls, but still this transition is also, since the new Commission with the Green Deal, with the European Green Deal, we have a new pathway, a much stronger direction towards climate neutrality. And that was not there when all the instructions for EEA was formulated. So what we need now is also to highlight that we need advice, evaluation, we need a body who focus more on this transition, since it's such a big transition. And then, of course, the collaboration with EEA is very important here, so they don't do the same. But I really believe that agency has been so willing to help out and make sure that there is not competition, there is support.
Thanks a lot. Lots of questions still, but we need to move slowly to the second panel. But just to give a gist of what people are referring to, I think there's a big question about what is going to be the accountability of policymakers, and not to mention the elephant in the room, the council, because at the end of the day, IPCC reports need to be approved by governments. Governments need to be taking notice and, you know, participating in the process. So probably not for an answer right now, but I do think that this question of accountability, because indeed there's a lot of science, right? But at some point when politics is speaking, especially in the council, you know, the world of science is disappearing. So I think this is going to be one of the challenges. Also quite a lot of questions about carbon negative technologies. And I would like to refer to the fantastic EEAC report on this topic. But clearly we are at the stage where, you know, there are many voices talking about the need to have frank discussions about this. And there is no, you know, silver bullet that the scientists are able to say, yeah, this is the way to go. So how will we work on this particularly divisive topic, and what sort of science will be needed to inform policymakers, which might have to make decisions without certainty on what sort of carbon negative technologies to go for. I want to thank again all our panelists for this first panel, and yeah, really welcome any further interactions we can have together, because as we said, it's about collaboration, it's about creating an ecosystem, it's about building those bridges between science and policymakers, and I think all of us have different roles, but complementary roles to make this happen. So thanks again, and best of luck with all your work, and especially around Fit for 55 for MEP Guteland, but also, you know, looking forward for upcoming reports from E3G and ESAC on this. So thank you very much. Now we're going to turn, bye-bye, we're going to turn to the second panel. And, you know, we decided to have all the women in the first panel and all the men in the second panel. I'm joking, no, it's just happens to be like that, but that means we still are keeping an absolute balance between in terms of gender, which I think is fantastic. So, you know, what can science advice do further? I mean, we've talked about what is in place, we've talked about the existing ecosystem. We want to get more into the details of the role of advisory bodies also at the national level and how this is going to quite work with the EU level. But we also want to talk about modeling studies and difficult issues. You know, farm to fork and agriculture and land use is one of those issues where there is a lot of division, or division is being brought as one of the key issues that is contaminating further the terrible politics around this issue. So I'm very excited that we have three panelists joining us. So François Desjans from the EEA, Peter Molgaard, and I hope I'm saying your name right, and Pierre-Marie Aubert. So let's start first with François Desjans. So François, you are the head of the group Climate Change Mitigation, Energy and Transport at the EEA. You have more than 20 years of experience in the field of environment and climate change. And you've actually done quite a bit of work on the analysis of the progress of Europe towards climate and energy targets. So, and you have also analyzed the work of national advisory bodies. So, you know, when we look at all of this, and given what Elisa said, that we need to have this role of both creating a holistic approach, accountability, but also legitimacy, but also, you know, at a more practical level, analyzing the progress towards the targets in an independent way, so we can know really where we stand. So what would be your view about what is needed further?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, I would like first to talk about what we can expect from the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change, and then try to outline some of the challenges that I think it will have to address. Let's start with the results of a study that the EEA commissioned earlier this year on national advisory bodies. We looked into the landscape in the EU, and we found that there's been recently a proliferation of these types of bodies, while in fact there are maybe just, well, almost every country in Europe today has some sort of advisory body, but only 10, 11 countries have an actual independent scientific body on climate change. What we found was that those independent scientific bodies can make really policies much more effective. But their efficiency really depends on how robust the governance framework is, so how they fit in that governance framework, and also on their mandate and resources. We also looked at the different functions that those advisory bodies can have. We found three main functions. One is a function of monitoring policies, so the watchdog function, and this monitoring activity can add weight and accountability through policy evaluation. We also have another set of functions that is related to the advisory mandate, providing scientific guidance and making concrete policy recommendations. And we have a third main function, which is one of a convening body, engaging stakeholders and citizens to open up a climate policy debate. Can we expect all these three functions now to be fulfilled by the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change? If we look at the mandate, I think it's probably going to be more the watchdog and the advisor function. So there will be a function of monitoring policy and monitoring the progress towards the targets, and one also of providing scientific guidance and advice. And that is clearly reflected in the tasks of the new advisory board. If we look at those tasks, they are about considering findings of the IPCC and other scientific institutions, organizations, providing scientific advice and ensuring reports on existing and proposed EU targets, budgets, measures. Another task is to network and gather scientific knowledge available in Europe. So I think there's a strong network dimension, both in relation with the EU Scientific Committee and also with the work of the national advisory bodies that already exist. Finally, a very important function in my view, which is identifying actions and opportunities, but still standing on the facts and analysis. So what picture emerges from these different tasks and the way the advisory board has been defined? First, I think there's a clear remit. It will be an advisory board that is delivering science to policymakers, standing on robust evidence and good scientific basis, but it's not an advisory board that will make policy. It will not be involved directly in making decisions. It has to provide the tools, the keys, the knowledge to the policymakers. It has to analyze options, but it's not the one that is going to take those decisions. And there's really a need to be very clear about this remit. I think we can outline a couple of principles that will define this advisory board. The first one is scientific excellence. There have to be 15 senior scientists. They will have to be the top scientists in the EU on different sciences relevant to climate. But there's a notion of interdisciplinarity, and I think that it also resonates with what Elisa was saying. It has to be strongly rooted on climate science, but climate science as broadly defined. If we look at the mandate of the three working groups of the IPCC, it ranges from the physical science to a broad range of disciplines that are relevant to climate science, but that are not necessarily the climate science. And that's, I think, a dimension that is also very clearly emphasized in the climate law. So in the interdisciplinarity and in an international context as part of this principle of scientific excellence. Another principle is one of independence, and that has already been outlined. And I think there's a clear mandate or clear definition of independence in this body. It's clearly independent from the EU institutions. It will have to be relevant, which means providing timely and trustworthy knowledge, standing on facts and robust analysis. There will have to be it will have to be a balanced board in its composition in terms of gender and geography. So all different parts of Europe will have to be represented through 15 members. And I think maybe two other dimensions. I mentioned networking, and again, networking will be a key aspect of the role of this advisory board. No matter how it is resourced, it is not going to deliver its own science. It will have to tap into all the results that are available from the scientific community, especially the EU-funded scientific committee, because there's many research projects today that are taking place, and the EU is investing massively in climate science. And it will be a challenge, probably. I will come back to that, to tap into, to consolidate this knowledge. And I also mentioned the networking dimension with the existing advisory board. And finally, I would say an important principle is one of accountability. I mean it in two ways. Of course, the advisory board will keep the EU and the national policymakers accountable for their commitments under the Paris Agreement and under their own targets. But the advisory board itself will have to be also accountable of its work. It will have to show that it can work effectively, efficiently, and really bring added value. So what will be challenges and success criteria for this advisory board? As the analysis from the EEA showed, any climate advisory body, regardless of type, is only effective as governance context and resources allow. And if we look at the governance context, what helps advisory bodies fulfilling their mandate of guiding policy formulation, it's recurring and regular cycles as input channels, access to different government branches, and opportunities for outreach to stakeholders and the public. The input to the regular policy cycle is there in the climate law, because it is explicitly mentioned that the Commission will have to propose new budgets or new targets based on IPCC and other scientific bodies and the advisory board. Maybe we can see how this will take place in practice. It's not really hard-coded how, it's not an obligation to provide, for example, a direct response to the advices of the board. So it will be important to see then how the advisory board input will be taken into account. In terms of resources, the advisory board will be supported by 14 experts.
Finish, because you are up to your 10 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So as the EEA will support the advisory board with a secretariat of 14 persons. So that will be the core resources fully dedicated to the advisory board. And finally, a last challenge, I think, will be the communication of the scientific results. We talked about it already. The advisory board will have to translate the scientific complexity, scientific uncertainty for policymakers who are not always fully equipped to understand those nuances. And I think that will be a key challenge for the advisory board to deliver knowledge that is already existing, but that still faces some hurdles, some obstacles to be fully taken into account. So I think I will stop here. Sorry for taking longer.
No, thank you. And thank you for bringing the outcomes of this research, super interesting and highly relevant. Before I turn to our next panelist, I just wanted to just mention a little bit what people are asking. So science background of policymakers, does it make a difference or not? What sort of policymakers we have? Because indeed there's an issue about communication and understanding science. Someone questioning why, or is there enough attention being paid to biodiversity and health versus hard climate science? Or question also about citizen science. How can citizens be part of the ecosystem? Should we have hybrid bodies that include civil society, not just science? Can one ever be neutral? And obviously citizens, scientists are also human beings, they're also citizens. And as we know, it's very difficult to remain neutral. And also a more specific question about whether climate science uses or not randomized control trials. So as you can see, there's a wide remit that you'll be able to respond to. And thanks also for all of those who are providing studies and examples from Ireland, from MEDEC, really super interesting. Keep it going. So now turning to Peter Moberg, and I hope I pronounce your name not too badly. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
So you're the chair of the Danish Council on Climate Change. You're also the dean at the Maastricht University School of Business and Economics and a professor of industrial organization. Wow, what a wide remit. And you have an MSc degree in economics and also MSc and PhD from the European University Institute in Florence. And also you have a background from the Danish Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Economics and Business Affairs. So indeed, you've been on two sides. So tell us your experience as the chair of the Danish Council on Climate Change, and also what do you think the European level can learn from the lessons that you've drawn from your experience so far? Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Celine, and you pronounce it beautifully. I think it's one of my favorite ways of pronouncing it. Anyway, thanks, and a warm greetings from sunny Copenhagen. It's a nice and crisp day here, so beautiful. I'd like to talk about the experiences of the Danish Council on Climate Change in the spirit of knowledge exchange, and I also built on the previous speakers. I think I would like to think of this as a possible way, or the way we are governed and the way we operate as possible inspiration for the organizing of the EU Climate Change Science Advisory Board. And so let me try. I have a few slides. Let me try to see if I can share my screen. And I have a number of examples at the end, Celine. And if we need to cut, then I will just cut one of the examples out. So, or two. Let's see if this works. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Thank you. So what I would like to do is say a few words about what the Danish Council on Climate Change is, who we are, but not so much who the persons are, but the competences that we have, and also the institutionalized role of the Council. And then I would speak to the benefits of this advisory council and the three roles that we also have. We have a role as a watchdog for government in climate policy, and as an advisor to the government and parliament on the construct of climate policy, and then we are also a convener and contributor to the public discourse. So we have those three roles written into the Climate Act. Let me dive into it, and here you can see the council, and I'm not going to mention the names, but I would mention the competences that we have in the council. And so we have a professor in biological oceanography. We have, I'm going from left to right. We have competences in transport economics, sustainability of agricultural and food systems. And then I'm, as you said, Celine, I have a background in energy economics and regulation and energy infrastructure. Then we have a sociologist with an expertise, for example, in the sociology of consumption. We have engineering, especially energy efficiency in the built environment. We've got energy systems. Then we've got environmental and resource economics and forest economics. And at the end, macroeconomics and economic policy. And we span 6 different universities in 3 different countries. So in that sense, we are widely put together. And why do I emphasize this? We really have different competences. We were set up, it says here, by the Danish Climate Act of 2020. In fact, there was a previous act 5 years earlier. So we have been existing since 2014. But the new act gave us more members, a wider remit, and also a more formalized structure. And I think we are very independent. Maybe to clarify, we don't see it as ourselves to second guess or question or in any way the IPCC. So we take the IPCC reports more or less for granted, and then we sort of translate it into a Danish context. See what does that mean for Denmark, and what does it mean for Danish climate policy in particular. So we are not out there to repeat in any way what we already know quite well, I think. on climate science, but to translate it into climate policy. We are very well supported by a secretariat that has now grown to, when I started as a chair 3 years ago, we had maybe 8 employees in the secretariat, and now we have more than 25 employees. So it's really a growing organization. And you would say we are very happy to be a member of the EEAC, or to coordinate with our fellow councils and to give inputs to policymakers in regard to setting up the European Climate Change Council. And just a few words about how we operate in this. Of course, we have, right now we are, for example, working on a report on transportation, heavy transportation, so lorries and trucks and stuff like that. And of course, we have an expert in the council, but we all contribute. So we are engaging in what I would call, first of all, integrative thinking. So we look at this particular subject from a variety of different angles, and each of us come to the table with our expertise. And there's a very nice working environment where we all contribute with what we have, right? So it is very, very interdisciplinary what we do. And the other tool that we are developing more and more, so we are very conscious of that, is systems thinking. So systems thinking also means that you somehow, when you look at, for example, transportation, you look at what is a transportation system, how does it relate to other parts of society, and what are the crucial interdependencies that we need to have in the analysis, and what can we sort of justifiably cut out. So that's also a very, and then we think about the system, and we also zoom in and out to make sure that our systems thinking is the correct one. And I can speak more to that later if you want in the Q&A. But for now, I want to move on to a bit about the institutionalized part of the government's climate policy. So we have something which is rather unique, I believe. I think it's also there in the UK, but we have an annual review of the government's climate policy. And basically what we have to do in February is to assess if the combined climate policy of the government ambitious the carbon latest, and people are discussing if that shouldn't be before. We have an ambition of a 70%, so 70% reduction in 2030 compared with 1990. And we have in 2025 a 50 to 54% reduction compared with 1990. So that's quite steep also compared with the European targets. But we think there's a reason for that. If we are to contribute, that's also an analysis we've made in the Climate Council. If we are to contribute fairly to the Paris Agreement, those targets are necessary. Now, what we have in February is an assessment of the government's climate policy to test if it is sufficient to reach those targets. And so we are now working on, for example, our next February report. In February, we concluded that that was not enough. And then Parliament can take that. So we concluded in February 2020 that, no, wait a second, 2021, that the climate policy of the government was not sufficient to reach the 2030 target. And then Parliament can take that up and say, well, then you have, dear Mr. Climate Minister, you have an extra task to do. Please come up with a policy that does meet those targets. And so that's the ongoing, that's part of the annual wheel. We also, in the spring, review and comment on the Energy Agency's greenhouse gas projection. And so that's also a commentary on the, you could say, the statistical foundations for the climate policy. And the government, Danish government, will come out in a few weeks from now with a new climate program, which is the one that we assess in February. But we have an early review of that and comment on that to also say what can you possibly adjust before we look at it again in February to make sure that it's sufficient. Celine, did you want to say?
1 more minute.
All right. Okay. Then I really have to rush. I'll skip this. This is overlapping. Then the benefits of a council. We have those three roles: as a watchdog, as an advisor, and as a contributor, convener, contributor to the public debate. I think we what I do want to say is give one example of the benefits of a council. We have this holistic perspective. I already talked about that. We are an objective voice. We don't have any vested interest. We are very public about if we talk with stakeholders. But let me give you one example then, if I may. One example is from biomass and biomass use. And the Danish energy taxes have given an incentive to switch from coal to biomass in our combined heat and power plants. And if you look at it, that really means a greening of the energy consumption in Denmark. So according to the UN greenhouse gas accounting rules, this reduces Denmark's greenhouse gas emissions. But in a report from 2018, the Danish Council on Climate Change had taken a broader perspective and a closer look at the assumption that bioenergy or biomass use is carbon neutral. And we wrote a report that concluded that the carbon dioxide emissions from biomass for energy are not necessarily zero. And so this depends, of course, on a lot of factors, and therefore we advocated stricter regulation and sustainability criteria for the use of biomass. And so having a scientific council with the ability to look at biomass more broadly played an important role in the debate and has influenced the implementation of new sustainability criteria for biomass in Denmark. I also have another case on power to X and one on creating policy, coming up with new policy ideas. But I think that might have to wait to the Q&A, if at all. Thank you, Celine.
Thank you, and we'll make sure to share your fantastic slides with everyone. So thank you so much for bringing the Danish experience. I think what's particularly exciting about Denmark is that you are the new frontier because your government is going further than other governments. So you are the ones that have the task of inventing reinventing the possible for all of us. So, good luck with that, and we'll come back to this in the discussion. Now, turning to Pierre-Marie. So Pierre-Marie works for IDRI, and it has a truly interdisciplinary background, biotechnical sciences, so agronomy, forestry, but also political sociology, which makes him a very relevant speaker for us in terms of, what sort of scientific advice you need to put in place to inform the just transition in the EU and specifically in terms of the agricultural, food and land use sector. Pierre-Marie also teaches at Sciences Po Paris, Agro Paris Tech and University Paris Sud. So we're really excited to hear from you, Pierre-Marie. The floor is yours. And I'll keep you to 10 minutes because I know you're French, so I'm a bit worried about.
No worries. I managed to. Thank you, Celine, and thank you to everyone for this great event. So, as Celine said, I'm going to focus on the agricultural and food sector, and more particularly on the role of modeling. So, amongst the different facets of science, I'm going to focus on modeling. My starting point is quite simple. I think we have, at least for the agricultural sector, but I believe for the sectors it's clear as well, we have a clear overall direction of travel given by the IPCC report on land, the IP-based report on biodiversity ecosystem services that tell us that basically the agricultural sector is responsible for the bulk of biodiversity loss. We have the WHO Nutrition Challenge report from 2018 as well. And those different reports from scientific bodies have translated in a way in like policy documents, strategies. We have here the Farm to Fork, we have our national low carbon strategy in France, and those are like strategies only, if I may. They are not policies, they are not regulations, they are not subsidy programs, etc. And so what we have now is a sort of gap between strategies and concrete policies. And what we have is also a vast amount of policy questions around the strategies that explain, at least partly, why we have that gap between strategies and concrete policies and regulation. And this has to do with the cost of implementing those policies. Well, this is MEP saying, well, we cannot implement the Farm to Fork and we cannot have align the cap with the Farm to Fork because it's about livelihood and it's about jobs. And because, for example, here we have the agri-food sector, which is the first manufacturing sector in the EU. And if we apply the Farm to Fork, that's gonna destroy those jobs, etc., etc. And those policy debates, those policy questions are in fact fueled by the limitations of existing modeling tools. And also, as Céline said earlier, the strategic use that is made of those resources, the results of those modeling tools. And I have two examples in mind. One is the USDA report published a year ago, almost a little bit less than that, that basically said that a strict implementation of the Farm to Fork would lead to a disaster, if I may, from an economic and a social point of view, because it will lead to an increase in the price of food and a decrease in the competitiveness of the EU, etc. Without that much precautions in the way in which those results were explained. We had this summer the GRC reports on the Farm to Fork, which took a lot more caution when explaining the results, saying that, well, we only implemented in the model part of the Farm to Fork strategies. We were not able to implement or to model per se changes in diet, changes in farming systems, because we don't know how to model how those farming systems will transform according to progresses, technological uptake, etc. So basically, but what happened nevertheless is that many stakeholders and the most conservative ones use those reports to say, well, look, if we really implement those strategies, that's gonna fail, that's gonna lead to a disaster, so we should not do that. And they use those reports as sort of weapon to oppose any regulations. So what we have is a situation in which, even though for the GRC report, it was really cautious in the way it was expressed, we have stakeholders using that science to say, no, we don't want that, that's not possible because we have planet against the people and we need to put people first. So in view of that, my argument here is that we have two major requirements in the way we use modeling to feed the policy process. The first is that we need to develop modeling tools that are better adapted to address just transition questions, which basically means that we need to bring together or to hold together biophysical questions and socioeconomic questions. And the state of play today is that we have very robust biophysical models that show us the direction of travel. And we have, if I may, very weak economic models that are based on supply-demand equilibrium that are totally unable to capture the structural transformations that are at play if we want to keep the food system within planetary boundaries. And farms, processing industries, consumer behaviors, all of that will change and those changes cannot be captured by the economic models we have. So we need to couple socioeconomic and biophysical dynamics and to link the functioning of the food value chains or food systems to the impact we want to apprehend. So I won't be long here, but I just wanted to show you that that is exactly the sort of models that are being developed by many stakeholders, but not totally mature yet. But the idea is really to start from biophysical scenario and be able to characterize upon which conditions. And that's the way in which we need to resonate. What we do at the moment is that we take biophysical scenario and we say, what are the impacts? That's not the way we need to resonate. We need to say, okay, we have planetary boundaries. Then the key question is upon which conditions the transformation of, in that case, food chains can generate, if I may, virtuous impacts on farm employment, agri-food jobs, and cost of food. So we need to take the other way around, not assessing the impact of a biophysical scenario, but rather taking, as it was said earlier, biophysical constraints as a starting point. We have only one planet, and raising the question upon which policy conditions here can we have the right transformation there that will deliver not only the right impacts on the biophysical side, but also on the socioeconomic side. So that's what we published a couple of months ago, focusing on France. And we have now a second requirement, and with that, I hope I will be in the time frame. The second requirement is not to await everything from models. Even though we managed to get the sort of model I was talking about a minute earlier, we need to use them to explore options and trigger discussions involving all stakeholders, and not at all as tools that would give us ready to implement solutions. That's not what we need. And in that sense, the impact assessment that are mandatory in the EU policy process are really important, but need to be taken with a lot of caution. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, this is the price of the wheat on the international market. And in black curve is the real price observed. And all the colors are what models predicted at some point on some others. And you can see that it was all the time totally bullshitting, if I may, sorry for that. So we don't need, we really need not to use them as crystal balls to predict whatever, but rather as tools to trigger multi-level dialogues and look at pathways rather than only the final pictures. Oh my God, this will deliver these 10 years down the line. No, no, no. What we need to explore is what are the steps we need to take now in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time, if we want to go that direction. What are the no regret options? And with that, I'm done. Thanks, Celine.
Thank you so much, Pierre-Marie. That was so interesting. So I know that many will want to see your slide and so relevant given the highly polarized debates we're having and will continue to have on the terrible CAP reform and hopefully the more exciting farm to fork policy discussion, which is about to start. Questions. So there were a lot of questions that I already mentioned earlier, but one that I wanted to ask all of you is going back again to this question of transdisciplinarity, because I've been on the assembly of the mission, the EU mission on soils. And it was quite striking to me to see that, yes, there were scientists from many different disciplines. They were all stating their bit. But then at some point, the chair or someone needs to be doing some sense making and needs to be confronting the different points of view. Otherwise, you have just a long list, and I call a shopping list of all sorts of things, but you haven't really confronted things. And it was quite striking to me to hear, Peter and describe his group and how, there seems to be this sort of quality of conversation, which takes time. And also Pierre-Marie talked about, this quality of dialogue that we need to do. And certainly EEA has experience also on that. So, and then, to draw from one of the questions, biodiversity, health, are they sufficiently there? Are we really having enough confrontation of those different points of view? So I don't know, Peter, do you want to start? And then François and Pierre-Marie.
It's funny that you should mention agriculture, and because we have one report that came out at least half a year later than I had expected originally, and that was had to do with the lowlands peat and how if you flood that, how it's so complicated and so many different points of view. And indeed, I was working overtime to get people to talk, and we decided to let we needed to have the dialogues, continue the dialogues until we understood each other sufficiently that we could come out with a report that would somehow bend everybody's points of view in a council. That was the hardest, I think, to date, the hardest report to continue the dialogue until we and I think it became a report that was a lot better than if we had stopped earlier, right? So it's also a matter of listening to each other, and I think that's one of the things that we have become really good at, is we come with our different disciplines. We sometimes understand the same words differently, and really the dialogue and the deep dialogue and allowing time for that is a crucial element in that, which conflicts a little bit sometimes, of course, with coming out with advice that is relevant in a given policy process. But that's where we have decided, opted for, since this has to be science-based, it means that the scientists somehow need to agree on at least, and we're working a lot, not with consensus, but with consent. That's a very practical tool, actually. Consensus means that everybody should have the same opinion. That is unlikely to happen in any council with different disciplines. But we are working with consent, and that means that you sort of give the permission. You are okay with moving forward in this case, and I think that's a crucial tool in this in these councils, and it's one of the things that we are very explicit about.
Thanks.
So
really
using
like
consent.
Consent versus.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, thank you, Peter. Really good. François?
Yes. Well, I think transdisciplinarity is an issue that becomes more and more prominent when as we move towards decarbonization. As we have harvested low-hanging fruits, now we come with the more difficult solutions. And we know that we need to address properly, for example, take the energy transition. We need to address certain impacts or aspects of development in renewable energy and sustainability aspects of let's take wind energy. We know we need to address issues related to biomass. So questions that become much more prominent than they used to just a couple of years ago. And I think, indeed, I can reflect that at the European Environment Agencies. You have had the different scientists, natural scientists, or climate experts, and we by default we have to work much less in silos and cut across much more the different disciplines to take into account. Well, it's not about just biodiversity, it's also about circular economy and resource efficiency. And we need to be able to combine those different knowledges together to come with not the ideal, the best option, because there's no silver bullet, but to come with informed decisions that minimize side effects and trade-offs. And clearly in the advisory board, there will be this difference of perspectives and different disciplines. As Peter was reflecting, there will have to be some consensus built, and if not consensus, I like also the term consent. And I guess here also the role of the chair is fundamental to build that consent. But ultimately, this advisory board will have to speak with one voice and will have to work as a team. So that also something that will have to be managed beyond the pure expertise. It's also a question of persons and being able to reach a team spirit in that advisory board that is able to put aside some differences to be able to come across with one voice to make the messages more impactful.
Thanks, and that brings me to also a reflection that sometimes if you take very famous scientists that have no time and that are not able to spend time with each other, it looks very good on paper, but then in practice, in terms of what the group can really, produce in terms of the quality of conversation might not be there. So definitely sort of dilemma that you see in many of those bodies. Pierre-Marie, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I will come back on what you said, Celine, on the fact that biodiversity and health are potentially, well, not that well taken into account into policies. And one thing here, coming back to my presentation, is that it's really difficult to model that. Modeling the impact of this or that on biodiversity or on health is much more challenging than on climate, for a simple reason, is that for climate, we have a very simple indicator, which is CO2 equivalent, right? And even though we know the limitation of that indicator because we convert methane and N2O into CO2, etc., we have it, and we can sort of optimize every functions of the system based on the minimization of that, right? And this brings me to this question of models and transdisciplinary, etc., and to a sort of formula or whatever that one colleague of mine used to say. When you have a model, the problem is that everyone looks at the figure and forget about the caution or the things you say, the limitations of your model. But when you don't have a model, nobody listens to you, right? So you have this big tension. And so the situation now, if you look at the food system discussion, if I may, is that it's really difficult to characterize the impact of the food system on biodiversity and vice versa, the impact of biodiversity losses on the food system functioning. And this brings us to a situation where as soon as you start speaking about biodiversity, everyone says, no, we cannot say anything because we don't have the figures, we don't have the model, we don't have this and that, right? And we have huge discussions regarding how to model it, etc. So I won't be long here. But that's for me a key point. And so at the same time, we are sort of trapped. Well, we try to escape that trap, but we are trapped between the need to improve our models to factor in biodiversity in a better way, which is what we are which is what we are doing with other colleagues at the international level, and at the same time, make it clear for stakeholders that we cannot expect everything from the models. And as I said earlier as well, that if we want to sort of bridge the gap between models and reality, we need to think in terms of policies, actors, power, which is far beyond the question of modeling. It's about actors, it's about like who does what, who gains what from which policies. And so interdisciplinary is not only about like how to better model, how to assess this and that, it's also about how we bring together scientists able to characterize the system and scientists able to, the biophysical system, if I may, and scientists able to characterize the policy system and ways to transform it. And in some cases, we need also strategists that are not necessarily scientists.
Thanks, Pierre-Marie, and thanks for bringing this issue of power and power balance, because it is indeed quite an important factor in terms of approaching systemic change. I would love for us to have more time for questions. I know that people in the audience wanted to say, how do you assess systemic thinking? I'm sure you would have a lot of things to say on that, but okay, since we have only 3 minutes left, I really want to thank you all. It is my privilege to have to try and summarize what we've talked about, which is somewhat difficult, but I think what's really clear is that there's a huge expectation on science to be guiding Fit for 55 and the great transition to go towards carbon neutrality. That what we have put in place right now in Europe holds great promises of a more holistic approach, of the ability to create long-term accountability, to increase the legitimacy of decisions, but that clearly we are still trapped, and we need to be aware of the traps of interface between science, policy, and politics. We talked about neutrality. Is it possible? Everyone has convictions at the end of the day. Uncertainty, there is always uncertainty in science, and it was also good to hear from MEP Gutenant on the reason why we have the precautionary principle is also to be helping us to make decisions in a context of uncertainty, but also the fact that, at some point science needs to stop to allow for the responsibility of policymakers, people who are elected, and who are representing democratically the view of citizens, which sometimes does clash with science. I think we talked also about the fact that the fundamentals need to be in place, whether it's transdisciplinarity, funding, capacity to provide inputs in a timely way during the policy cycle. We talked also a lot about methodologies, you know, systems thinking, the right sort of modeling, being able also to have a rapid feedback loop because science is advancing very quickly, and also the quality of the conversations that need to happen between the scientists, and this idea of consent versus consensus. And last but not least, an enabling framework where policymakers are actually able and willing to listen to what science is saying, because otherwise, if it's falling on deaf ears, it becomes quite frustrating for scientists and for citizens. And last, we talked about the ecosystem that we need to have in place. Citizen science, individual scientists who are all willing and able to contribute, the national bodies whose role is really to fundamentally localize science and inform local policy contexts and choices through science, whether it's IPCC or other science bodies at the international level, but also this ability that national bodies have to go further in the case of Denmark, because the policy question that is asked of them is fundamentally different given the level of target. And we also talked about the fact that it's really important for all those bodies to be networking, to be collaborating, and also that we have this challenge of the sense making of this rapidly evolving body of science, which is, you know, enormous. If you just look at anything that is produced on Horizon Europe, you have more reading than your life would allow you to make. So, you know, how can we continue building this ecosystem, and maybe finishing with the fact that the ecosystem also needs to be communicating in a way that works for policymakers and also works for citizens, and that this remains, you know, a challenge, because in my view, transition is a change of civilization, and it involves deep conversations at all sorts of levels with all parts of society being able to be contributing, because otherwise you see backlash and unfortunately the wrong conversations on the wrong topics, while we don't have the time for those. So I really want to thank you all, and I want to thank you specifically our panelists, but also all of you, the participants who are, you know, the living parts of this ecosystem. And let's hope that, you know, we rise to the challenge, and that we are able, all of us, to work together to give that right advice, to be honest, to be neutral, and to really, you know, provide what is needed for policymakers to advance at the speed that is required, so we can, you know, save our climate, but mostly and most importantly, save ourselves, right? Living well within planetary boundaries. This is our moonshot, and I really look forward to more conversations with all of you to make it happen all together. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.